Hi everyone, I'm Alex, and in this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to animate using the GNU image manipulation program. So we're going to be making a bouncing ball today. This is the classic animation exercise, which basically just teaches you a few principles. But first, let's consider, should you animate with the GNU image manipulation program? Now, there's a number of limitations of this software which makes it unwieldy for animation processes. First, it lacks animation features such as frames. It treats layers as frames, and you have to use layer groups to create layers within frames, which is about as intuitive as it sounds. Secondly, it has very poor default settings. The default keyboard shortcuts are really horrible. The program looks very strange when you open it for the first time. A lot of vital functionality just doesn't have a keyboard shortcut by default. And finally, GIMP is weird. Like, if I hit Control semicolon, I've just now made the entire layer wood. There's also a brush which paints capsicums. Like, GIMP is just out there. If you're used to Photoshop or Adobe Animate, you're going to have a hard time adjusting to this program because it's just not on the same level. The primary advantage is that you own the software. Whereas if you're using Adobe Animate, Adobe can just decide at any time to revoke your access to the program or to use your art to train AI models without your consent or to increase the subscription price. GIMP is free and open source software. You will always have access to it. You will need GIMP 2.0. Actually, this should be 2.x. Any version of GIMP that's like 2 point whatever is fine. You might be asking why not use GIMP 3 because GIMP 3 is the latest version, and it's because it sucks and I hate it. You will also need a drawing tablet, so I have a Wacom Intuos, and the reason this is handy is because it allows you to essentially draw rather than using a mouse. You can use a tablet. The plan for this video is I'm going to show you how to set up GIMP in a way that facilitates animation. This involves changing a lot of the default settings, which are trash. Then we're going to go through the process of creating a new document and the animation process. And then finally, we're going to go into exporting your animation as a GIF file and sharing it. All right, let's begin. So the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to install the GNU image manipulation program. So we're going to go to GNU image manipulation program downloads. You'll see download GIMP 3.2.4. Now this is actually wrong. So you're going to want to go and download GIMP 2.0. And if you click this link, you will be met by this incredibly intimidating looking page. Now this is actually just a file system. You'll see there's folders for Linux, Mac, and Windows. So if you're a Windows user, you'd click Windows, and then there's so many different files here, but really what you want is just like GIMP 2.10.0 setup.exe, which will literally just download the installer for you. Once you've got GIMP installed, you can launch it. And the first thing you'll notice is that it looks like an absolute dog's breakfast. What is going on here? How come there's 3 separate windows? Now, you might be wondering, did the program install correctly? It did. It just has a really bad default. So by default, it displays all of these windows, or dockable dialogues as it calls it, separately, but we want to consolidate them. So we're going to, if you go to the top panel and go to Windows and then tick single window mode, that's so much better. Now we can actually see what we're doing. On the left here, we've got our brushes, and we've also got some brush settings. And then on the right here, we've also got some brushes, but the main thing you'll want to be concerned with is this layer dialog in the bottom. To create a new image, we can go to File, New, and this allows us to specify the size of our image. So I'm going to go 480 by 360 pixels. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is how brushes work in GIMP. So you have the brush itself, which is essentially a texture. So you can pick from a circle or like a star or like whatever this is. I personally prefer this circle brush, which is called hardness 100. You can configure the size by pressing the closing square bracket and opening square bracket on your keyboard. And you can press the backslash button to reset the size to 20 pixels. You can also configure the hardness of the brush, which is how smooth it appears, like this. But the most important thing I want to draw your attention to is this dynamics menu, because it's very poorly communicated. But this is the center of how brushes work in GIMP. So if I go to dynamics and I set the dynamics to pressure opacity, and I have a drawing tablet connected, when I touch my drawing tablet, when I apply a light pressure, it is very transparent. And the harder the pressure I apply, the more opaque the brush is. There's also a dynamic called pressure size, which essentially the hardness mediates the brush size. I'm going to show you how to create your own brush dynamics. So what you've got to do is click Windows, Dockable Dialogs, and then head to Paint Dynamics. And this will create this menu here where you can see all of the brush dynamics and select them. Now, the default ones are terrible, so we're going to go ahead and click and create a new one. So we're going to click this button here, create a new dynamics. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm just going to call it tapering. Now, the first thing you'll be greeted with is this obtuse looking so-called mapping matrix. So essentially, I'll explain how this works. If the vertical dimension is brush properties and the horizontal dimension is tablet input properties. So if I tick the intersection between pressure and size, now the tablet's pressure correlates to the size of the brush. And if I tick opacity and pressure, now the brush has both opacity and size correlating to pressure. And one thing I like to do is with this drop down here, we can see opacity and we can see pressure here. So this might not make sense, but let me explain. So when there is zero brush pressure, we have zero opacity. And when we have complete brush pressure, we have complete opacity. But one thing I like to do is actually create a custom curve. I like there to always be a little bit of opacity at the start. So even when I'm using the lightest possible touch, it's still visible. This basically determines the mapping between level of brush pressure to level of opacity. So for my tapering brush, I like to have it be about this curve. That's how that works. And you can see here, I've got the brush preset here. So and you can choose these dynamics from this menu as well. I don't know why it's in two places. It just is. These shortcuts here are my preferred keyboard shortcuts for GIMP. The first thing you're really going to want to do is go Edit, Preferences, and then you're going to want to go to Interface, and then you're going to want to scroll down, and you're going to want to tick Use Dynamic Keyboard Shortcuts, because you have to tick a tick box to have custom keyboard shortcuts. You're also going to want to tick Save Keyboard Shortcuts on Exit, And then you're going to click Configure Keyboard Shortcuts. And this is going to bring up this horrible dialog box. But essentially what we can do now is I can search Paintbrush. And this will bring up the keyboard shortcut for the paintbrush tool. And you'll see I have it set to B here. By default, it's P. So if you click here, it will let you set a shortcut. If you do something that's already taken, it will ask you whether you want to overwrite the shortcut. For the move tool, I like to set it to V because that's what Sprite has. For the eraser tool, I like to set it to E, which is the ellipse tool by default. For the select by color tool, you'll notice that if I search it, it doesn't even appear. It's called by color select in here. So I'm just going to set this to W because I believe that's the shortcut for Sprite. Bucket tool is Shift B by default. I am fine with it being Shift B. Now, the other keyboard shortcuts I like to set there are two specific things I like to set. When I draw a layer, if I move it with the move tool, you will notice the layer's boundaries actually exceed the image boundaries. And that's because in GIMP, layer boundaries are indeed separate to image boundaries. However, you might want to make the layer boundaries consistent with the image boundaries when you're moving it. So to do that, what you actually have to do is you have to right-click the layer and go layer to image size. Now this is a pain, so I just went into edit keyboard shortcuts, layer to image size, and I set it to Shift Control Q. You can set it to whatever you like. Another keyboard shortcut I find useful is the merge layer group. So if you have a group of layers, this is a group, but if I wanted to merge it, I have to go right click merge layer group, but I set a custom keyboard shortcut for that to Control Q. The other two keyboard shortcuts I really like are hue saturation. What this allows me to do is it allows me to modify the hue and the saturation of the layer, and I set it to Control U. You can't actually apply this over a layer group. So if I merge the layer group and then I apply it, and there's one last keyboard shortcut which allows you to view each layer as an animation frame. By default, there's no keyboard shortcut for that, which is ludicrous. So what I did is I just set playback to Control P because that way I can just hit Control P and I can view my animation, which is much easier. You can specify the magnification of your animation, the playback speed, and the frame rate, and then you just hit play here and it gives you a handy little preview. There is also an option to configure how long you want each frame to be in milliseconds, and the syntax to do this is very intuitive. You just go opening parentheses 100 ms closing parentheses, and that means my frame will last 100 milliseconds. Okay, so animation. The first thing you'll want to do is create a layer group, and then because each layer group will act as a frame, so the first thing we need in each layer group is actually a copy of the background, because the GNU image manipulation program does not support onion skinning whatsoever. So we actually need a transparent background for every frame. And then I'm going to add a layer called guides. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in some guides here. So using the paintbrush tool, I'm just going to hold Shift and Control, which allows me to create a line. This is going to be the ground. And I'm also going to create a center line. So I'm literally just going to eyeball this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to lower the opacity of the guides so that it is transparent. Now I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to call it frame. We're going to go pose to pose with this one rather than straight ahead. I want this ball to hit the ground here and then bounce. Actually, no. I want the ball to bounce like this, and then like that, and then like that, and then like that, so that I can hit V on my keyboard and I can move the layer. Now, GIMP is very strange. When you move layers, the bounding box of the layer also moves. So you'll see that I cannot actually draw outside this area. Layer to image size. And what this will do, you can also access this on the right-click dialog menu of the layer. It will reframe the layer to use the same boundaries as the image. If I draw here, and then I move this layer, and then I apply layer to image size, and I drag back, it's gone. So I'm going to animate my key poses, which are the ball. It's going to start from here. In this lesson, I'm also going to expose how naive of an animator I am. Now you might have noticed that the ball doesn't really align here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my rectangular selection tool, and I'm going to select this area of the ball. Now, you may naively think we can switch to the move tool, and if we drag it, it will drag just the selection, but no, GIMP does not work that way. What we actually have to do is hit Control X for cut, and then Control V for paste. Now we have what is called a floating selection. So I can click and drag this, and I can move it around. But now that we're in this floating selection mode, we actually can't paint or draw at all. So what we have to do is flick back to the rectangular selection tool and click anywhere that is outside of the selection to apply it. So now that I've moved this layer into place, we can see I'm not really happy with this, so I'm just going to adjust the curve a little bit. And one other thing I might do is I might actually use the rotate tool here. That's I can just cheat a little bit to adjust the trajectory. Another tool that's useful is the shear tool, which allows you to perform a shear. Unfortunately, you do not obtain any wool from this. Another tool which is useful is the freehand selection tool. I like to call it the lasso tool. I just set it to L for lasso because it's easy to remember, and it's just my muscle memory at this point. So once again, the lasso selection, Control X, Control V. Now I have this as a free selection, and only now may I use the move tool to move these. So one thing I don't like is the spacing of these frames. It's all about the timing and the spacing. So spacing needs to be, if you've ever heard of the animation principle of slow in, slow out, essentially the frames should not have an equal distance, because then the animation will look too static and like linear. Anyway, I might actually animate a second bounce as well. One practical issue we've run into is we've run out of space for our canvas, so we can go image, canvas size, and then it actually supports arithmetic operations in any numeric input box, which is very handy. So you'll see if I resize here, all the layers have resized too. So in GIMP 2.8, you used to have to manually resize all the layers every time you resize the canvas, but it seems they've fixed that in 2.10. So now that that's out of the way, I'm going to animate a second bounce, and it's going to be about as good as you think. Okay, so now that I have my plan, I'm going to go ahead and actually animate this. So the first step is we're going to create our so-called key poses, or extremes if you like. So now that I have this layer, I'm going to call this frame 1. And now, here's the crazy thing. I'm going to actually duplicate this layer, and I'm going to delete this. I'm going to delete this. And you'll see our guides are here, but we can just very transparently see the frame behind it. So I'm actually going to lower the opacity of the background just so I can, and the guides, just so I can see what I'm doing here. So I'm actually going to make the background greater than 50% opacity so that it renders for each frame, I think. And then I can animate the next frame, which is going to be very close to the original one because of the principle of slow in, slow out. I'm going to animate the next frame. I'm going to delete this. One lesson that you will learn very quickly if you choose to pursue animation is that animation is a very time-consuming hobby. Just something as simple as animating a walk cycle will take you a long time. Takes ages. So the next thing is I'm going to draw this frame. once again, I'm demonstrating my extreme level of training in art. If I want to play it back, I can press Control P. This will activate the playback. Yep, and now you can see that there is indeed some animation happening here. Now, by this point, you may be wondering whether animating with GIMP is worth it. The answer is it depends. It's free and open source software. You're not feeding the evil corporations like Adobe when you use GIMP. Now, you may have noticed these frames are misaligned, so I'm actually going to go and move them just using the move tool, and then I have a keyboard shortcut for layer to image size so that the layer boundary is not affected. Just like that. Now I'm going to have this frame be the ball just touching the ground, squash on this frame, and then stretch on the next frame. Now you may have noticed that the volume of the ball is inconsistent, so I'm actually just going to cheat. I'm going to use the scale tool to just bring it down a little bit. I'm also going to move this frame a little bit. So again, move tool, and then since I don't want the layer boundary to be messy, I just layer to image size. Oh, actually, I've made a mistake in my animation plan, and this is a good opportunity for me to teach you how to animate good. So this is a poor example of slow in, slow out. The frames should actually be clustered around here because the ball will have the lowest inertia, I guess, at the apex of its arc. You'll notice that you have to toggle the opacity of every frame in order to move through them. This may get annoying and tedious if you're a sane human being. However, if you're not a sane human being, this is not a non-issue. And then I'm going to add another frame, and then I'm going to add another frame. Now I want the ball to slow down at the apex of this arc. However, I've done this incorrectly because it shouldn't slow down horizontally, only vertically, because that wouldn't make any sense. So I'm actually dumb. So we're going to, once again, the preview tool is handy for actually doing what's called a screen test of your animation. You can see here it looks decent, right? But it should maintain the horizontal momentum. So I'm actually thinking this should go here. This should go here. Forgive me for my Australian accent. I know it's pronounced here, but I ain't an American, guys. we don't say no or like no. We say no. Australians are weird. You'll notice there's sort of a battle happening between my plan and what actually looks good. So if you're an animator, there's sort of a constant tension between the logical and creative sides of your brain. You're constantly trying to make something that looks good and makes sense. This frame is misplaced. I'm going to move it over here, and then I'm going to use the shear tool, which is Shift H. This should go here. Now, this is the animation principle of arcs in effect. Just read The Animator's Survival Kit by Richard Williams. He explains way better than I do what any of this means or why it's important. Now, the ball is not going to rise as high the second time because of some physics I'm not educated enough to explain. You will also notice that because I've decided to go against my animation plans, that I've made things a little harder for myself. This frame should be here. This frame should be here. Oh yeah, fun fact. Holding control restricts movement to cardinal directions. There needs to be more frames clustered around here, so I'm actually going to bring this up a little bit. Finally, I'm going to have the ball squash here. I'm going to actually have it touch the ground here, and I'm going to do a screen test again just to see whether this is looking any good. It looks decent. Now, at this point, having these guides here is not particularly useful, so what I'm going to go and do is I'm going to delete them for every single frame. Yes, that's about as fun as it sounds. You cannot press the delete key to delete frames. I thought you could, but you can't, so you're just going to go ahead and that means you will have to expand out all of these frames here to be able to delete the layer. Once again, Sprite has a tremendously more intuitive and usable user interface to this. However, it does not really facilitate hand-drawn animation. It's purely for pixel art. So you can see here that I've got a bouncing ball here. What now? We're going to finish off the animation just by having it rest. So and now I'm doing it straight ahead, so I'm gonna screen test this. Yeah, that looks about right. And I'm just gonna have the ball not bounce anymore. It's just gonna move forward a little bit just to resolve out its momentum nicely. And okay, and that is a bouncing ball. So you may be asking yourself, well, that's great, but how do I now export this animation so that I can use it somewhere else? Well, the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to save a working file. So I'm just going to call this bounce1.xcf. XCF stands for excellent file, by the way. I'm also going to delete the guides for each layer. Now I want to export this as a graphics interchange format so that I can share this graphic with other people on the interwebs. Now, if you just try to export it, by default, it won't animate at all, which is about as intuitive as it sounds. You'll notice there's no animation whatsoever, which is just great, because the default is it doesn't animate at all. So you actually have to tick this tick box which says add animation, because obviously you wouldn't want GIFs to animate. Who wants GIFs to animate, right? There's also an option for how many milliseconds you want each frame to last. By default, this is 100. Frame disposal where unspecified. Now, this is an option that will really make your head spin, but just put it as replace. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that it gives you this ridiculous looking error message. Cannot export RGB color images. So this error message is actually very misleading, and I'm going to tell you exactly how to solve it. So the real issue is that GIMP cannot export animations which have layer groups. I know. So I'm going to create a copy of this file called bounce1export because I don't trust myself to overwrite this file. And then what I'm going to do is merge or flatten every frame of the animation. So we will be discarding the layer groups here. And doing this by hand is tedious, so I'm going to create a keyboard shortcut for it. Merge layer group, and I'm going to set it to Control Q. I don't care whether Mac users think that's quit. And then I can literally just press up to go up a layer and then press Control Q, and then I can repeat that for every frame of the animation. And now when I play back, it's the same exact thing, but if I export it, and I tick as animation, and I set this to replace, and I export it, now the GNU image manipulation program has indeed rendered our animation. However, you'll notice the frames are not as fast as we want. That's because we had it on 2 times speed, which actually means we want 50 milliseconds per frame. So I'm just going to do that. Yep. And now you can see we have a bouncing ball. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you taking the time to actually look at this tutorial, because this is basically the result of 5 or so years of me just learning how to use the program with trial and error. And I figured it would be useful to translate that knowledge into something a bit more accessible so that hopefully it doesn't take you so long. Thank you for watching, and I will see you later.